If I asked you how many James Bond movies Pierce Brosnan has made, and which was his last appearance as Bond, what would you answer? Common knowledge would say that Brosnan was in 4 Bond films: 1995's GoldenEye, 1997's Tomorrow Never Dies, 2000's The World Is Not Enough, and 2002's Die Another Day, which would be Brosnan's last turn as 007, right? But what if I said that both of these answers were incorrect, and that there was another Pierce Brosnan Bond film that most people aren't aware of? 2004's 007 Everything or Nothing is more than just a James Bond video game. It is the 5th and final Pierce Brosnan James Bond movie, complete with a script written by Bond movie writers, an opening theme song performed by a major recording artist, and even its own movie poster. Because of how this game is positioned, the question then becomes, does it hold itself up alongside GoldenEye and The World Is Not Enough as one of Brosnan's best? Or does it fall into Die Another Day levels of ridiculousness? On top of that, how does it fare as a game in its own right? This is Chris from Makopowered, and welcome to a special Bond for the Holidays episode of Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not widely considered classics, or sometimes even good, are still worth examining and maybe even playing despite themselves. If you haven't watched the James Bond 007 Game Boy episode from a year ago, quick refresher. Growing up, TBS's 13 Days of 007 was a staple of my holidays, so I've always associated James Bond with this time of year. Hence, James Bond episodes for the holidays. So let's get to it. 007 Everything or Nothing was published by EA as the third of 7 games they would release before losing the James Bond license, and the third of 4 not based on an existing Bond movie. Everything or Nothing was developed by EA Redmond, which had prior experience developing Bond games, having made 2001's much more generic Agent Under Fire. EA Redmond would work on the follow-up Bond game as well, 2005's From Russia with Love, well, the follow-up Bond game that actually has Bond in it, before changing their name to... Wait, is this right? Oh wow. Okay. Before changing their name to Visceral Games and making the Dead Space trilogy. Sorry, the reason I'm so shocked is because the shooting mechanics for Everything or Nothing are not what you'd expect from the people behind Dead Space. We'll get to that though. Also, can we just take a second to appreciate the slogan here? EA has definitely changed since this was released, huh? From the outset, Everything or Nothing was positioned to be the next Bond film. For one thing, the game's script was written by Bruce Firestein, who wrote GoldenEye, Tomorrow Never Dies, and co-wrote The World Is Not Enough. You know what? That's some decent Bond cred. Here he's working with a story by Paul DeMeo and Danny Bilson. While this duo hasn't really worked on Bond movies, the comic geek in me got instantly excited when I learned this. Why? Because DeMeo and Bilson were behind the criminally underrated 1990 Flash TV series with John Wesley Shipp. Before moving on, let's just take a moment to discuss the title. Up until The Living Daylights, Bond films had all been named for either full James Bond books or the titles of short stories. Either way, all of the titles came from the Ian Fleming source material, even if the movies themselves didn't. Looking hard at you, Moonraker. When they ran out of Fleming titles, the producers still tried to keep the Fleming influence. GoldenEye is named after the retreat Fleming used to stay at to write the Bond books, and The World Is Not Enough is actually Bond's family motto, again from Fleming's original books. Tomorrow Never Dies and Die Another Day sound like Steven Seagal direct-to-video movies though, so yeah. Anyway, Everything or Nothing is an interesting case because while it references the history of the Bond franchise, it does not come from Ian Fleming. Instead, it is the name of the production company Harry Saltzman and Albert Broccoli created to make the Bond films. It was called Everything or Nothing because of the risk both men were taking in initially bringing Bond to the screen. In this regard, it's an interesting and apt title for a video game trying to be a full entry in the storied film franchise. What about the game's cast though? Up until 007 Nightfire, Bond games had sound-alike voice actors, and they couldn't even get Brosnan's likeness for Agent Under Fire, leading to Bond looking kind of a lot like Sterling Archer. Here though, not only was Pierce Brosnan fully on board, so was Dame Judi Dench as M, and John Cleese, here officially as Q instead of R, and before he decided to show how much of a piece of trash he is. On top of that, EA managed to get some big name talent to fill out the cast. Alongside Q, Masaki Ito plays Miss Nagai, Q's new assistant. Maya, in addition to contributing the theme song for the game, plays the cleverly named NSA agent Maya Starling. Shannon Elizabeth takes on the role of geologist Serena Saint-Germain, and Heidi Klum plays nanotechnology expert Dr. Katya Nadanova. Oh, and freaking Willem Dafoe plays the main villain, former KGB agent Nikolai Diavolo. There is one more bit of casting, but it seems odd? Richard Kyle reprises his role as Jaws here. Sort of. See, he never actually says anything, despite talking at the end of Moonraker, yet he gets billed as a voice actor here. I don't know, maybe it's for likeness rights and motion capture performance? It is weird that he's included not as an unlockable character as in GoldenEye, but as a part of the main plot. Jaws hasn't been seen in a Bond film since the aforementioned Moonraker, which was released in 1979, so his presence is a callback not to any of Brosnan's films, but to the Roger Moore Bond movies. The thing is, that's not the only Moore-era callback in the game. Diavolo is set up as the protege of Max Zorin, Christopher Walken's character from 1985's A View to a Kill. This seems to confirm that Pierce Brosnan's and Roger Moore's James Bond are one and the same character, because Diavolo wants revenge on Bond for killing Zorin. Sorry, fan theories. The problem with both Jaws' inclusion and Diavolo's ties to Zorin are that neither really seems to matter to the overall plot all that much. And before we get ahead of ourselves, let's just slap a big ol' spoiler alert up there going forward. Well, I mean, as much of a spoiler alert as one really needs for a typical James Bond plot, I guess. So yeah, Diavolo is planning to use the nanobots developed by Nadanova, who is secretly working alongside him, in order to take over first Russia and then the world. He'll be able to do this because the nanobots have been modified to consume and destroy all metals except for platinum, a metal he's mined extensively in Peru to outfit his personal army with, and a convenient way to insert Shannon Elizabeth's geologist character into the plot. Going back to the Moore-era callbacks though, yeah, it's set up that Diavolo wants to kill Bond for killing Zorin, but by the end he just wants to kill Bond for interfering with his plans. As well, considering Jaws doesn't once use his, well, Jaws, he could just as easily have been a new character. There is nothing unique to his role here. Here's the thing though, that argument could be applied to almost all of the supporting characters. Heidi Klum's character is supposed to be a brilliant nanoscientist, but the closest we see to her actually working with nanotechnology is hiding a vial of nanobots for Diavolo in her bra. It's also not really explained why she's working with Diavolo, she just is? Likewise, Shannon Elizabeth's character is supposed to be a geologist, I guess in keeping with Denise Richards' role as a nuclear physicist in The World Is Not Enough, or perhaps as another Moore-era throwback, Tanya Roberts in A View to a Kill. Ah, okay. I see what you did there, writers. Well played. Unlike Roberts' Stacey Sutton, however, Elizabeth's geologist doesn't really get to demonstrate any geological knowledge. It seems like her entire purpose is to be A, a damsel in distress, B, eye candy, and C, plot spackle, offering up the clue to the next plot point when needed. The closest she gets to actually being a geologist is mentioning the platinum mine near her research station in Peru.
I heard the guards talking about a platinum mine on the north side of town.
Masaki Ito's Miss Nagai seems to just be there for Bond to flirt with and to hold gadgets like she's a model on The Price is Right. Honestly, the most fully developed supporting character here seems to be Maya's DEA agent. She's undercover as a lounge singer in New Orleans in order to get close to one of Diavolo's henchmen, and she actually does sing in a lounge in the game and act as a proper agent. Admittedly, she's also uncovered, captured, and made helpless pretty quickly, so nobody wins! I guess it's better than how Britt Eklund was treated as a fellow MI6 agent in The Man with the Golden Gun, but that's not exactly saying much. At least none of these characters requires an escort mission. I'm looking at you, Natalia and GoldenEye. The closest Everything or Nothing comes to this is the boss battle where the player saves Maya, but even then, it's just a matter of stopping the overhead conveyor from pulling her into the crematorium. She's suspended above the actual fight, so she's not actually in harm's way otherwise. Well, okay, there is one other instance, but we'll get to that. Still, the issue here feels like more of a focus on plot than character development. In other words, stuff needs to happen to maintain interest, so who cares if these characters are fleshed out or not? The game's story also adheres to a rather obvious formula, one covered by James Chapman in his book, License to Thrill, A Cultural History of the James Bond Films. In it, Chapman discusses how Roald Dahl revealed the so-called three-girl formula after writing the screenplay for You Only Live Twice. You use 3 different girls, and Bond has them all. No more and no less. Girl number 1 is violently pro-Bond. She stays around roughly the first reel of the picture. Then, she is bumped off by the enemy, preferably in Bond's arms. In bed or not in bed? Wherever the writer likes, so long as it's in good taste. Girl number 2 is anti-Bond. She works for the enemy and stays around for the middle third of the picture. She must capture Bond, and Bond must save himself by bowling her over with sheer sexual magnetism. This girl should also be bumped off, preferably in an original fashion. Girl number 3 is violently pro-Bond. She occupies the final third of the picture, and she must on no account be killed. Nor must she permit Bond to take any lecherous liberties with her until the very end of the story. We'll keep that for the fade out. Now, obviously, Everything or Nothing varies from this formula a bit. Maya doesn't die, but she does just kinda disappear from the plot after sleeping with Bond. Yeah, Nadanova is killed, but it's a little unclear? She's in the jet with Diavolo near the end of the game, and it seems like Diavolo fires his ejector seat and she doesn't, but it's never confirmed. She also never actually sleeps with Bond, but they both reference her promise to throughout the game. Then there's Serena Saint Germain. The only variation I can see in her role is that she just goes for it after Bond wins the rally race. Wrapped around the mission structure for the game, though, is the standard Bond movie structure, which, when played out in gamic form, is actually kind of cool in its familiarity. For example, when the game starts, and once you get past all of the opening logos, the player gets the obvious 007 gun sight intro. What the game does after this is kind of unexpected, but also kind of shouldn't be. See, instead of going to the game's main menu, it tosses the player into an opening stinger sequence, where Bond has to foil the sale of a suitcase nuke, retrieve the device, and then escape before he gets blown up by a jet. From here, the game launches into the opening titles, which, along with Maya's title track, which is better than both Sheryl Crow's Tomorrow Never Dies and Madonna's Die Another Day, Fight Me, are designed to look exactly like the titles for a Bond movie proper. From there, it's the standard megalomaniacal villain tries to take over the world plot that Bond movies had kind of just fallen into at that point. Yes, it's formulaic, but there is something to be said for the comfort of formula. Right, MCU? These issues, the one-dimensional characters and formulaic plot, are common complaints with the last Brosnan theatrical release, Die Another Day, and they're not the only things that carry over. Everything or Nothing definitely shows the influence of some of that movie's more, let's be generous and call them bombastic elements. For one thing, the general holding Dr. Nadanova hostage at the beginning of the game flies his helicopter onto a platform hidden in the middle of a river. Okay, kind of Spy Who Loved Me, but not too over the top. Until a force field pops up and Bond and the player need to take out the 3 generators powering it. To be fair, it's hard to say whether this particular instance can be blamed on Die Another Day, see the whole diamond-powered Skybeam or Ice Hotel thing, or just, well, video games. It definitely has an end-of-level boss feel to it, so it's entirely possible it's the latter. What is clearly a direct tie to Die Another Day, however, is the fact that the cloaking device from Bond's car shows up here as well, and is turned into a gameplay mechanic. And that seems as good a segue as any to discuss the driving in the game. So, quick confession, I wasn't particularly good at the driving sequences, despite them being built on the Need for Speed Underground engine. I've gotten used to shoulder buttons being the gas and brake pedals, and wound up using the face buttons instead, because I had forgotten that the Underground engine also uses the right analog stick for those functions as well. So part of my issue with the driving sequences is definitely my fault, which, you know what? Fair enough. That doesn't mean there aren't problems though. For one thing, I found the time limits for a lot of the driving sections to be exceedingly tight. Again, part of that might be my fault, and that's fair. What isn't is that there are instances where the player isn't even told what the time limit is. For example, when chasing the general's train at the beginning of the game, there is definitely a time limit. I know because I hit it a few times. This is particularly frustrating when the player runs up against glitches, like in the Pawnshop Train bridge mission, where Bond needs to stop Jaws from driving a tanker full of the metal-eating nanobots into the heart of New Orleans. Don't ask me why the nanobots aren't consuming the tanker, just go with it, I guess. Anyway, there are multiple points where Bond's Triumph motorcycle, and yes, it's a Triumph, the game makes sure the player is explicitly aware of it, gets caught up on scenery and other vehicles. So much so that cool stunts which should be possible aren't, like trying to use this flipped over car as a ramp to jump a jackknife tanker. Then there's the part of the mission where Bond has to drive into oncoming traffic, which is a cool set piece, but this happened. Thankfully, I didn't encounter anything like that in the full-on rally race the devs shoehorned into the game. I suspect the thinking was, hey, we've got the NFS Underground engine, it'd be a waste if there isn't one legit race involved. As such, it's used as an excuse for Bond to get close to Diavolo when he wins the race, but it's still a little jarring nonetheless. I guess you could argue that it's sort of a callback to Zoran's horse racing thing? Maybe? Then there are the missions where the cloaking device on Bond's Porsche Cayenne, and again, the game goes out of its way to make sure the player knows it's a Porsche Cayenne, are made necessary. So, okay, on the one hand, it is really cool that there are missions where the locales Bond is in are opened up, and the player can drive around Grand Theft Auto style. On the other, the player doesn't really get the chance to do that because they are trying to avoid roving patrols, Metal Gear Solid style. That's right, they turned some of the driving segments into stealth segments. Stealth segments with a very prescribed way of completing them. Any variation from what the developers expect from the player and you will get spotted, which usually leads to running out of time while you're getting chased. Don't get me wrong, it's a neat idea. The implementation just leaves something to be desired. Which, to be honest, kind of describes the regular combat and gunplay as well. Everything or Nothing has let's call it a unique approach to combat. Because it's third person instead of an FPS like Agent Under Fire and Nightfire before it, the control scheme was changed so that it doesn't play anything like a first person shooter. Instead, it uses an almost siphon filter-esque lock-on system for when Bond shoots at an enemy. The interesting part about this is that once the player locks onto an enemy, they can then move an aiming reticle around the enemy's body with the right analog stick to fine-tune where Bond shoots. This sounds good in theory, but there are two issues with it. One, because the right stick also controls the camera, the player can easily find themselves moving the reticle without meaning to, and, say, firing at the enemy's feet or over their shoulder rather than directly at said enemy. Two, the lock-on requires Bond to be facing his target full-on. There is no side lock-on, and just because the player can see an enemy doesn't necessarily mean Bond can. This can lead to inconvenient inconsistencies with the lock-on, which can be a problem because of the real major flaw with combat. You cannot aim to shoot without locking onto a target. Sure, you can shoot your gun without locking on, but Bond will just shoot from the hip directly in front of him, which is essentially useless and a huge waste of ammo. Even Siphon Filter let the player have a manual aim in addition to the lock-on mechanic, and that game came out in 1999. Early 1999. Not here though. This can be particularly frustrating when facing Diavolo's elite soldiers, who come equipped with cloaking devices of their own. What this means is that when they're not attacking, they're almost invisible, and when they're almost invisible, they can't be locked onto. This wouldn't be a problem if there were a manual aim in the game, but that's not the case. This honestly got so bad with the final mission that I am not ashamed to admit that I bumped the difficulty down to easy in the end, because it was the only way I was going to beat the game with these guys swarming me. To be fair though, they don't show up until the final act of the game when Bond is invading Diavolo's base of operations. Most of the time, as long as the player is careful, the shooting mechanics are something the player can adjust to, and the targeting cursor with the lock-on is an interesting, if flawed, approach to Bond's sharpshooting skills. Just like with the driving segments though, stealth has been shoehorned in here as well. It's clear that Everything or Nothing was developed in the wake of Metal Gear Solid 2 and Splinter Cell because there are a lot of influences from those games that appear here. Tranquilizer dart gun that's slow to reload? Yup. Crouching to reduce noise made while walking? Uh-huh. Bond wearing a tactical stealth suit, Sam Fisher style? You betcha. A gadget that allows Bond to scout ahead without being seen himself? Oh yeah. Inconsistent sightlines for enemies? Wait. So yeah, the enemies are not exactly consistent in what they can or cannot see and hear. A lot of the time, I just threw stealth to the wind and started running and gunning. Which, if I'm being honest, is a bit of a relief that the developers allowed that as an option. Except for the one mission where they didn't, which is actually part of a larger issue with the game overall. See, you know how I said that the car stealth segments had a very strict way to complete them, and varying from what the devs expected would lead to a game over? That mentality permeates the entire game. It feels like the devs had a very specific script in mind for the overall experience, and the player gets punished for not strictly adhering to it. For example, in the mission where Bond infiltrates Diavolo's tank depot, I kept getting overwhelmed by enemies, including the cloaked ones, each time I tried to go in on foot. Eventually, I realized that the devs wanted me to take control of the tanks in the depot using the network tap gadget Q had given me. It hadn't even occurred to me that the tanks would be automated and I could do that. Then there's the cliff dive sequence in which Bond has to save Serena, who has been thrown from a helicopter by Nadanova. Any variation in path down the cliffside means the player is taking too long and Bond cannot catch up with her before she falls to her doom. While I get the desire to see specific scenarios play out, and the devs' scenarios are decidedly cool when you figure out what they want you to do, it also robs the experience of any Bond-like improvisation on the part of the player. Quick aside, the game has plenty of so-called Bond moments for the player to accomplish, like stylish enemy takedowns, narrow evasions, and the like. One is decidedly creepy though. In New Orleans, when Bond is trying to infiltrate the nightclub Agent Starling is singing in, he comes across an undressed woman waiting for a massage. The Bond moment here is pretending to be the masseur, giving this unsuspecting woman a rubdown, and then promising to fetch her a drink. I'm pretty sure this is sexual assault, and the devs actively rewarded the player for it. I thought this was Brosnan's Bond, not Connery's. Oh, and the gadgets are neat, but I would have liked to have seen them used for more. I mean, instead of having a stealth level as Bond himself, why not a stealth level as the Q-Spider, where the player has to avoid being caught underfoot? Or how about a car chase, not as Bond driving the Porsche Cayenne, but the RC car, as it has to get an explosive out of range or something. Finally, let's talk about the geopolitics in the game, or seeming lack thereof. The Brosnan Bond films may have been formulaic, but they still addressed, or at least commented on, contemporary geopolitics. GoldenEye was the most overt, dealing with the fall of the USSR and Russia's subsequent attempt to deal with the end of the Cold War. Tomorrow Never Dies is a pretty damning, if flawed, critique of media influence, and Rupert Murdoch specifically. The World Is Not Enough deals with, as Chapman puts it, the conflation of global terrorism with corporate capitalism, and Die Another Day touches on tensions between NATO countries and North Korea at the time, as well as the African conflict diamond trade. Here, though, it just seems like the writers are content to reiterate on the new Iron Man of Russia plot from Octopussy and, weirdly enough, the James Bond Game Boy game. Sort of. There is one sequence which suggests a little more going on here. Near the end of the game, Diavolo launches his assault on Moscow, the Kremlin specifically, and nearly succeeds, devastating Red Square. Bond and the player have to commandeer one of his platinum tanks to be able to prevent his invasion of the Russian seat of power. This hints at the shift Bond has had to make since the 80s, when it would have been unthinkable for him to A, be anywhere near the Kremlin, and B, actively defending it against a destabilizing force, since he was, at one point, such a destabilizing force himself. We're just going to set aside that this is the Russian premier whose regime Bond was protecting. 007 Everything or Nothing takes an intriguing conceit, the idea that a video game can be an official entry in the longest running movie franchise of all time, and tries to do some interesting things with that concept. These attempts aren't always successful, but they work enough to offer an enjoyable experience, especially if you're a fan of the Pierce Brosnan or even Roger Moore James Bond films. While the adherence to the traditional formula of the Bond films lends some shallowness to the proceedings, there's still enough of interest here to make it a good, weekend rental.